Imagine you're asleep right now. Your kids are in the back room, the house is quiet, the night is cold, and the person you married, the person you said I do to just 2 months ago, is somewhere in that same house with you. Now imagine waking up and finding them on the floor. You would call 911 immediately, wouldn't you? You wouldn't stop to clean anything up, you wouldn't go back to sleep, you wouldn't spend 6 hours deciding whether the wounds looked deep enough to worry about. You would scream, you would dial, you would be on your knees on that floor until help arrived. That is what any of us would do. But that is not what happened in this house. What happened in this house on the night of November 28th into the early hours of November 29th, 2020 in Farmington, New Mexico, is one of the most quietly chilling cases I have ever gone through. And I want to be careful with that word, quietly, because that is exactly what makes this one different. There was no dramatic chase, no missing person alert, no body found in the woods weeks later. This was a small home, a newlywed couple, a schoolteacher, a man who, by every account from every person who knew him, was the happiest he had ever been in his life. And yet, 3 stab wounds, chest cavity full of blood, both lungs collapsed, a man who had told people repeatedly that he had finally found his person, finally found home, a man who was holding a newborn grandchild the very evening before his body was found face down on the bedroom floor. And the woman who found him. She cleaned him up first. Now before we go any further, and I need you to stay with me here because this is the part that will sit with you for days, I want you to hear something. This is not something I am telling you, this is not a narrator's interpretation, this is not a dramatic reconstruction. These are her exact words, spoken out loud, inside the house, while officers were still walking through the rooms, while her husband's body was still on the floor behind that bedroom door. She looked at the people around her and she said, "I'm just going to say this now since everybody's recording. If you ever find me with multiple stab wounds in my chest, I didn't do it myself." Read that again. Take a breath and read it again. She did not say, "I can't believe this happened." She did not say, "Who would do this to him?" She did not say, "Please find out what happened to my husband." She said, "If this ever happens to me," she named the exact method, she named the exact location on the body, and she told the officers standing in her house that whoever tries to sell them on the idea that it was self-inflicted, that person is probably the suspect. Those were her words, not mine. And here is the thing that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read through these case files. She was right. Over the next several minutes we are going to go through everything. The 911 call, the body cam footage, the detective interviews, the neighbors, the son who loved his mother but could not make the math work in his head, the knife that somehow ended up back in the block, the text messages, the video clips on her phone recorded just weeks before, and the arrest 5 years later that finally closed this case. All of it is documented. All of it was obtained through official Freedom of Information Act requests submitted directly to the Farmington Police Department. What you are about to hear and read are real recordings, real statements, and real evidence from a real investigation. I am not here to sensationalize. I am here because cases like this one deserve to be seen. Victims like Robert deserve to be known. And the details in this file, the specific details, are the kind that make you rethink what you think you know about how guilt sounds, how grief looks, and how a person behaves when they are in a room full of officers investigating a death they say they had nothing to do with. Before we get into it, if you are new here, welcome to Time with X. This channel exists because true crime is not entertainment for me, it is documentation. It is accountability. Every case we cover is sourced, verified, and handled with the weight it deserves. If that is the kind of channel you want in your life, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss when we drop. And if you have been here before, you already know what we do. Stay with me, because this one is going to stay with you. Now, let us go back to that house in Farmington. It is November 29th, 2020. It is 5:40 in the morning. A woman named Heather has just called 911. Her husband Robert is on the floor. He is cold, he is stiff, and she is already talking. She will not stop talking for the next several hours. And with every word she says, the officers in that house will look at each other with the same expression, the kind that does not need words, the kind that means something is very wrong here. This is where our story begins. Before we talk about what happened inside that bedroom, we need to talk about who was inside that house. Because in true crime, context is everything. The people matter, the relationships matter. And in this case, the picture that everyone around this couple had painted of a happy home, a fresh start, a love story finally working out makes what happened on that November night not just shocking but deeply, specifically devastating. So let us start from the beginning. Robert Holbrook was 49 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, a big man by every account, the kind of person who took up space in a room just by walking into it. But according to everyone who knew him, that physical presence was completely at odds with who he actually was. Robert was autistic. He had spent years, decades, not knowing that about himself. And if you know anything about what it means to move through the world as an undiagnosed autistic adult, you understand what that journey looks like: the emotional dysregulation, the difficulty reading social cues, the sense that the world operates on a set of rules that everyone else seems to know and you were never given the manual for. According to his family, when Robert finally received his diagnosis, something shifted for him. The medication helped, the understanding helped. For the first time in a long time, Robert Holbrook was doing well. He had health issues, blood clots in his legs, ulcerative colitis, serious lung problems that his stepson Tyler said had been aggravated by exposure to insulation dust just the day before he died. He drank heavily. By Tyler's account, Robert had not gone a single day without alcohol since Tyler had known him. A fifth of vodka or a 12-pack of beer every night, sometimes more. But despite all of that, despite every complication and every challenge, the people in Robert's life agreed on one thing: he was happy. He was obsessed with his step-grandchildren. He would sit in his office chair holding the newborn baby and narrate a video game to her. He made plans, he talked about the future. He told his son Tyler that he wanted to build the back porch together. He told people who loved him that he had finally found his person. He was not a man who was looking for a way out. Heather Holbrook, formerly Heather Fernandez, was 4 feet 11 inches tall, a schoolteacher, the sole breadwinner of the household after Robert lost his job in March 2020 when the pandemic shut down his workplace. She had been a single mother for years before Robert came into her life, raising her son Tyler largely on her own. By all accounts, Heather was a woman who liked to be in control. Not in a malicious way, at least not on the surface. More in the way that someone who has carried everything alone for a long time tends to carry everything alone even when they don't have to anymore. Her son Tyler described her as fiercely protective, physically assertive when provoked. He admitted she had hit him as an adult, just 2 weeks before this night, and emotionally volatile in the mornings before she had her coffee. But she was also, by Tyler's account, deeply loving. The kind of mother who would say "I love you, son," with tears in her eyes when she'd had too much to drink. The kind of person who threw herself into relationships completely. And she had thrown herself into Robert. They had met at the library where they both worked. They had started their relationship just after Christmas 2019, less than a year before this night. They had moved fast. By September 2020, they were married. 2 months later, Robert was dead. The home was small, a trailer in Farmington, New Mexico. Heather's home, technically, with Robert moving in after the wedding. At the time of the incident, the house also held Tyler and his girlfriend Elizabeth, their newborn daughter, and their toddler son. 2 adults, 2 small children, a newlywed couple. And whatever history they all carried with them, compressed into a few hundred square feet. Tyler's room was at the far end of the trailer, then the bathroom, then Robert's office, the room where he kept his computer, where he spent his evenings playing Fallout and holding the baby, then the bedroom that Robert and Heather shared. The kitchen was central. The living room was where Heather said she spent most of that night, lying on the couch, scrolling through her phone, unable or unwilling to sleep beside her husband. It is a tight space, sound travels in a tight space, and that detail will become very important before this story is over. By every account, the evening of November 28th started normally. Robert was in his office playing video games. Tyler went in around 8 or 8:30 to ask about plans for the next day. He found Robert holding his baby daughter, showing her the screen. Robert was in a good mood. He looked, Tyler's word, fine. Tyler and Elizabeth took their medication, gave the kids their bath, and went to bed around 8:30 to 9:00. Their routine. They would hand the children off to Robert and Heather for the evening so the young couple could have an hour alone together. This was the arrangement. This was normal. At some point after 9:00, Robert and Heather were together in his office. At some point after that, around 11:00 to midnight by Heather's account, they moved toward the bedroom. And at some point in those quiet hours, everything in that house changed permanently. The neighbors, asked the next morning whether they had noticed anything unusual, said the couple always seemed happy. They had seen them walking together. They had seen Robert working outside. They had the impression of a couple that had found something good. One neighbor, though, mentioned something when pressed. She had heard yelling, somewhere around 3:00 or 4:00 in the morning, a male voice and a female voice, coming from that house. Not violent yelling, she said, more like someone having a time of it. She thought it might have been the people who sometimes cut through the yard at night. She was wrong about that. This is the world that Robert Holbrook lived in. This is the world that Heather Holbrook built around herself. And this is the world that officers walked into at 5:40 in the morning on November 29, 2020, cold, dark, and full of questions that the woman standing in the doorway was already working very hard to answer before anyone had thought to ask them. That is the thing about Heather. From the moment the first officer stepped through that front door, she was talking. And the more she talked, the less anything made sense. If you are watching this and something already feels off to you, trust that feeling. Stay with me. Because we are just getting started, and the next part of this story is where the first responders walk in and realize in real time that what they are looking at is not what they were told it was. Drop a comment below right now, just one word that describes how you feel about what you have heard so far. I read every single one. When officers arrived at the Holbrook residence at 5:40 in the morning, they were met with a grieving widow. That is the official description, grieving widow, and at first glance that is exactly what they saw, a small woman barely 5 feet tall, crying, frantic, throwing herself on the floor next to a body that was already cold. But within minutes, and I mean minutes, the officers standing in that house began to notice things. Small things at first, then bigger things, then things that could not be explained away no matter how hard they tried. Let us walk through it exactly as they did. Robert Holbrook was found on the bedroom floor, face down, his face resting on a laptop computer. He was cold to the touch. He was stiff. When officers checked for a pulse, there was none. Heather told them she had found him that way, face down, and had rolled him over. She told them he had complained earlier in the night that things hurt. She told them there had been blood but that she had not thought it was serious. She told them she had cleaned him up. She told them a lot of things. But the body told a different story entirely. When officers rolled Robert onto his back and got a proper look at his chest, the first thing they noticed was the wounds. 3 of them, deep puncture wounds to the upper chest region. Not scratches, not superficial cuts, deep wounds in vital areas that required significant force to inflict. The officers looked at each other. One of them said what they were all thinking quietly, half to himself. I'm just going to say this now since everybody's recording. If you ever find me with multiple stab wounds in my chest, I didn't do it myself. Whoever is trying to sell you on that is probably the suspect. That was not a detective. That was not some seasoned investigator reviewing the case after years of evidence gathering. That was a first responder standing in that bedroom saying out loud what the scene was already showing him. He had been in that house for less than 20 minutes. Here is where things start to unravel, and pay attention here because every single detail matters. Heather said Robert had stabbed himself with a steak knife. She said he had told her so. She said he had gestured toward himself when she asked what happened. She said she had not seen him do it but that he had confessed it to her in that dark bedroom in the middle of the night. So officers went looking for the steak knife. They found the knife block in the kitchen. Every knife was in it, every single one. The block was full. One officer pulled out the knives one by one, examining them, photographing them. Most were clean. But the steak knife on the far right of the lower row had something on it, a greasy residue, and at the tip, a trace of what appeared to be biological material consistent with blood. The knife was back in the block. Think about that. If Robert had stabbed himself 3 times in the chest with enough force to collapse both lungs in the middle of the night while bleeding, he then cleaned the knife and put it back in the correct slot, in the kitchen, which was not in the bedroom where he allegedly did this. Not one officer in that house could make that math work. If you have ever studied crime scenes, and I know many of you have because you are the kind of audience who does that, you know that blood evidence tells a story all by itself. Where it is, how much there is, how it got there, all of that is a narrative. The blood narrative in that bedroom was deeply wrong. There was blood on the bed, not a massive amount. Officers noted it was less than you would expect for 3 deep stab wounds, but it was there, concentrated in one area, mixed with what appeared to be other fluid. The mattress protector had absorbed most of it. But here is what was not there. There was no blood on the floor near where Robert was found. There was no blood trail between the bed and where his body lay. There was no blood in the bathroom. There was no blood in the office where Heather claimed he had done this to himself. If a man stabs himself 3 times in the chest and then walks or stumbles across the room to collapse, he bleeds while moving. That is not an opinion, that is biology. Blood does not stop because you start walking. And Robert's pajama pants. Officers noted this specifically. If he had been standing or moving after sustaining these wounds, his pants would show heavy saturation on the lower legs where gravity would pull the blood. They were not saturated, they were barely stained at all. The scene was telling them clearly and without ambiguity that Robert's body had been moved after death, that he had died where the blood was, not where he was found. Heather told officers she had taken Robert's shirt off to clean his wounds. A t-shirt and a sweatshirt jacket, she said. She said she had taken both off of him and thrown them somewhere in the room. Officers eventually located the shirt on the bed. When they examined it, they found something that stopped them. The blood on the shirt was not where you would expect it to be if someone had been stabbed in the upper chest while wearing it. It was on the right side, lower, not at chest level, the kind of distribution you might get if someone had been leaning over a body, if someone had been positioned above a person who was already lying down. Nobody said that out loud yet, but they were all thinking it. Throughout all of this, through the body examination, the evidence collection, the early questioning, Heather was present. And her behavior was noted carefully by every officer in that room. She cried, she screamed, she threw herself on the floor. These are the expected expressions of grief, but woven between them were things that were not expected. She laughed not loudly, not cruelly, but at moments when laughter was incomprehensible, little snorts, a chuckle at the wrong beat of silence. She was more concerned about what officers might find in her son's room, drug paraphernalia, she warned them, than about the investigation into her husband's wounds. She mentioned, unprompted, that officers might find BDSM materials in her personal belongings. On her phone, in her room, she brought this up while they were still processing the body. She tried to clean things. When officers told her they needed to preserve the scene, she continued to reach for things, touch things, move things, not aggressively, not obviously, but persistently. And she talked, constantly, filling every silence with more words, more details, more explanations, none of which quite fit together, none of which stayed the same from one telling to the next. This is the part that officers kept coming back to in their conversations with each other as they processed the scene that morning. Heather's timeline was not consistent. In one version, she saw blood between midnight and 2:00 a.m. She cleaned him up. She went back to sleep on the couch. In another version, she checked on him at 3:00 a.m. and that was when she saw the blood. She cleaned him up then. He was awake and coherent. In another version, she had been in bed with him when he said it hurt and then left to sleep on the couch because he had wet the bed. In another version, she was never in the bed, she had been on the couch all night. She had heard him say it hurt from the couch. Officers kept gently correcting her, asking her to go back, slow down, tell them again from the beginning, and every time she told it again, something moved, a time shifted, a detail changed, a version that had existed in the previous telling quietly disappeared. One officer, walking another through the scene later that morning, said it simply, the story was vague. Every time they pushed, it got vaguer, not more specific, the way honest memory becomes more specific when you concentrate. Vaguer, softer at the edges, like a story being managed rather than remembered. By the time detectives arrived on scene and were briefed by the first responders, the word that kept coming up in those private conversations was suspicious. Nobody was ready to say more than that yet. The investigation was still young. The autopsy had not happened. There was still a possibility, slim but possible, that some of this had an explanation. But that knife in the block, that blood on the shirt in the wrong place, that missing trail of blood, those 3 deep wounds that nobody could explain away. Something had happened in that house, and it was not what Heather Holbrook was describing. I want to ask you something right now, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. If you had walked into that house as a first officer, what would have been the moment that shifted it for you? The knife, the blood pattern, her behavior? Tell me below, and if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because the next section is where this case gets significantly darker. There is a moment in every serious criminal investigation where the scattered observations of multiple officers begin to converge, where the pieces that each individual person noticed separately get laid out on a table together, and everyone in the room looks at the picture they make and understands, without anyone having to say it, that this is no longer a routine call. That moment happened in the Holbrook case on the morning of November 29, 2020. The detectives had arrived, the scene had been processed, and now the people who had been inside that house for hours began to compare notes. What emerged from that conversation was not a theory, not yet, but it was a list of physical impossibilities that no innocent explanation could account for. We have already talked about the knife being back in the block, but it is worth dwelling on this for a moment because I do not think the full weight of it lands the first time you hear it. Robert Holbrook allegedly stabbed himself 3 times in the upper chest with a steak knife. These were not shallow cuts. The autopsy would later confirm that the wounds were deep enough to collapse both lungs and allow blood to collect around the heart. These were wounds that required force, directed, intentional force. After inflicting these wounds on himself while bleeding, while in severe physical distress with both lungs beginning to fail, Robert allegedly then cleaned the knife, then walked to the kitchen, then replaced the knife in the correct slot in the knife block, then walked back to the bedroom, then collapsed. Detectives ran through this sequence out loud with each other, more than once. Every time the same conclusion: it was not possible. A man dying from those wounds could not have made that journey, could not have had the presence of mind to clean and replace the weapon, could not have walked to the kitchen and back without leaving a single drop of blood on any surface between the bedroom and the kitchen. And yet, the knife was there, in the block, the only one with any biological material on it at all. Someone put it there, someone who was not dying. The forensic reconstruction of the blood evidence created a picture that was impossible to reconcile with Heather's account. The concentration of blood was on the bed, specifically in one area of the bed saturated into the mattress protector beneath the sheets. This is consistent with a person bleeding while lying in that position for an extended period of time. This is where Robert bled out. But Robert's body was found on the floor, face down, away from the bed, and there was no blood between the bed and the body, no transfer, no trail, no drops, nothing. For Robert to have ended up on the floor from the bed while still alive, while still bleeding, there would have had to be evidence of that movement in the blood. There was none. The only explanation consistent with the evidence was that Robert had died in the bed, and that someone had moved him to the floor afterward, someone who was careful, someone who had cleaned up after themselves, someone who had had enough time and enough presence of mind to manage the scene before making the phone call. How long had Robert been dead before Heather called 911? The question began to take on new significance. Detectives walked through the house and cataloged the weapons available, and there were many. The Holbrook home contained multiple knives of various sizes, a large sword behind the bedroom door, a collection of sharp objects that one officer described as having a medieval feel to it. If Robert Holbrook had wanted to end his life, and there was, at this point, no credible evidence that he did, he had options. He had a firearm. He had pharmaceutical options, given the volume of medication in the house. He had blades that would have been far more effective than a steak knife from the kitchen block. Why a steak knife? Why the least efficient, least reliable option available? Why a weapon that would require multiple attempts, that would cause prolonged suffering without guaranteeing a result? The answer, when detectives talked it through, was that a steak knife from the kitchen was the kind of weapon someone else might reach for, someone who was not planning this, someone who was in the middle of something that escalated. Someone who grabbed what was nearby. Detectives made the decision to secure the home and apply for a search warrant. They asked Heather and the other residents to leave while they processed the scene thoroughly. Heather agreed, though she was visibly anxious about what they might find. Her anxieties, as noted earlier, were specific. She was worried about her son's room, she was worried about her personal belongings, she was worried about her phone. Officers noted this. When a husband dies of unexplained stab wounds, the bereaved wife's primary concern is typically not what investigators might find in her personal item collection. The specificity of Heather's worry, the phone, the BDSM materials, the things in Tyler's room, suggested a mind cataloging its exposure rather than processing its grief. The search of the home produced several items of evidentiary interest. The steak knife was collected and logged. The clothing Robert had been wearing was collected. The washcloth Heather said she had used to clean his wounds was located in the bathroom, damp, with blood concentrated along its edges, consistent with it having been rinsed out after use. Consistent with someone cleaning up. Consistent with exactly what Heather had said she did, and exactly what investigators found most troubling about her account. Heather's phone was seized under the search warrant. That decision would turn out to be one of the most consequential of the entire investigation. There is a psychological concept in interrogation and investigation called the permission structure. It refers to the moment when investigators, having gathered enough to be confident but not yet enough to act, begin to communicate their suspicion to the subject, not through accusation, through observation, through implication, through giving the subject the opportunity to explain the inexplicable and watching what they do with that opportunity. Heather was given that opportunity multiple times in the hours following Robert's death. Every time she was gently confronted with a physical impossibility, the knife, the blood, the timeline, her response followed the same pattern. She acknowledged the problem. She said she did not understand it. She said she did not know. She said she did not think it was that bad. She said she was sorry. She said she had failed. I failed, those two words came up repeatedly, and they are worth sitting with. I failed is not the same as I don't know what happened. I failed implies knowledge of what should have been done, knowledge of a moment that passed, knowledge of a decision that was made not to call for help, not to intervene, not to prevent what occurred that is now impossible to undo. I failed is the statement of someone who was present for the thing that happened. Detectives heard that, they heard it every time she said it, and they filed it away. While the home was being processed, one of the neighbors came forward with information that cracked the timeline open. She had heard yelling. She described it as coming from the direction of the Holbrook home in the early hours of the morning, somewhere around 3:00 to 4:00 a.m. both a male and a female voice. She had not been alarmed initially because she assumed it was people who sometimes cut through the property, but it was unusual, she said. That house was not usually loud at that hour. She had never really heard them fight before. Yelling, male and female, between 3:00 and 4:00 a.m. at a time when, according to Heather, the only people awake in that house were her and her husband. Tyler and his girlfriend had taken their medications and gone to bed at 8:30. Tyler said he slept heavily because of his head injury medication. They had heard nothing. If the yelling came from that house, it came from Robert and Heather. If Robert and Heather were yelling at each other between 3:00 and 4:00 a.m., then Heather's account of a quiet night, a husband who hurt himself inexplicably, a wife who tended his wounds and went back to sleep was not the whole story. It was not even close to the whole story. By mid-morning, detectives had enough to know that this investigation was not going anywhere quickly. The physical evidence was compelling but not yet conclusive. The witness accounts were fragmentary. And Heather was cooperative in that particular way that some suspects are cooperative, saying just enough, agreeing readily to interviews, performing grief convincingly, while giving nothing that could be used definitively against her. They needed more, and there was only one person who could provide it. It was time to sit Heather Holbrook down in a room with a detective and give her the chance to explain everything, all of it, from the beginning, with nowhere to hide. Share this video right now if you are watching and cannot believe what you are hearing. Because what comes next, the formal detective interview, is one of the most revealing interrogation sessions I have ever read in a case file. She says things in that room that will make you stop the video and rewind. I promise you that. While detectives prepared to formally interview Heather, officers spread out to speak with everyone else who had been in or around that house. The son, the girlfriend, the neighbors, Robert's family, people who had no reason to protect anyone, people who simply knew what they knew. And what they knew was more than anyone had expected. Tyler was in his late 20s. He had a newborn daughter and a recovering head injury from a skateboarding accident that had literally taken a piece of his skull. He was on heavy sleeping medication. He was, by his own account, asleep before 9:00 p.m. and had heard nothing until an officer knocked on his bedroom door. When they told him Robert was dead, Tyler's first thought was the dump run they had done the day before. Robert's lungs were bad, they had been throwing insulation. Maybe he had inhaled something. That was Tyler's first reaction, not violence, not foul play, a reasonable, innocent explanation reached by someone who had no reason to suspect anything else. Then Tyler started talking, and the more he talked, the more complicated the picture became. He told officers about Robert's drinking a fifth of vodka every night or a 12-pack of beer. He told them about Heather's controlling tendencies. He told them about the time 2 weeks ago when Heather had hit him, her adult son, during a disagreement about a bottle of sparkling cider. He told them that when Heather was really drunk, she got very emotional. He told them that the only time he had seen her genuinely frustrated with Robert was in the kitchen on Thanksgiving, when Robert kept bumping into her because of his autism, but even that, Tyler said, was joking, not serious. And then Tyler said something that shifted the entire conversation. He said he did not think Robert had stabbed himself. "I don't think he stabbed himself, no, I think that's, honestly I don't know what happened, but why would you clean him up, why would you do that, leave everything there, leave it how it is." He was talking about his mother. He had not been asked to implicate her, nobody had suggested to him that she was a suspect. He arrived at that place himself through his own logic because the cleaning was the thing that kept pulling at him, the thing that did not make sense no matter how many times he turned it over. And then the detective asked him something that made him stutter. The detective asked whether Robert and Heather had ever hurt each other. Tyler started to say no, then he stopped. Then he said, "And I want you to hear how careful he is with this, how much he does not want to say it." He said that nothing crazy had happened, nothing like tying each other up or... He stopped again. The detective noted the hesitation, gently pressed, and Tyler admitted what he knew, that his mother and Robert were involved in BDSM activities, that his mother was typically the one who was restrained, that Robert had expressed discomfort with it at times, according to what Heather herself had told Tyler, because it made him feel like he was doing something wrong. This was significant, not because BDSM itself is evidence of violence, it is not, but because Heather, when asked directly about this in her own interview, denied it. She denied any such activity in their relationship. 2 accounts, from 2 people inside that house, directly contradicting each other on a detail that investigators could not afford to ignore. Elizabeth was quiet. She confirmed everything Tyler said about the timeline. Bed before 9:00, heard nothing, woke up when the officer knocked. She had nothing to add that materially changed the picture. But her presence in that house, her account of the routine, her corroboration of the basic facts, all of it helped investigators understand what a normal night in that home looked like. And what had happened on November 28th was not a normal night. Officers canvassed the immediate area. Most neighbors reported nothing unusual. The couple seemed happy. They had seen them walking together. Robert had been working on things outside, no concerns. But that one neighbor, the one who had heard the yelling. She was careful. She said she was not entirely sure. She thought it might have been people cutting through the property. She said it did not sound violent, more like people enjoying themselves, she said, with the particular vagueness of someone who does not want to say something definitive about someone she lives near. But she heard both voices, male and female, coming from that direction, at an hour when both Tyler and Elizabeth were deeply asleep on medication, at an hour when, if Heather's account was accurate, there was nothing to yell about. The neighbor's testimony would become one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, not because it explained everything, but because it proved that Heather's version of that night had a gap in it. A loud, 2-voiced gap between approximately 3:00 and 4:00 in the morning. Robert's mother, sister, and father arrived at the house that morning. Their grief was immediate and devastating in the way that the grief of parents always is. Officers spoke with them briefly and gathered background on Robert. The picture they painted was consistent with what everyone else had said. He had been happier than he had been in years. He was planning for the future, he was not in crisis, he was not showing signs that anyone around him recognized as a warning. But officers also reached Robert's first wife, Sandy, and what she revealed from years of old messages sent to her phone painted a different and more complex picture of Robert's inner world. In 2019, Robert had sent Sandy a message. It read, "I did not cut deep enough, I am making a mess." Sandy had not seen it in time to respond. She had not known he had passed away until she saw the arrest notice when Heather was taken into custody years later. That 2019 message was important, not because it confirmed the self-harm theory investigators had largely moved past that, but because it confirmed that Robert had a history that predated Heather, a history that perhaps Heather had known about, a history that could be useful as a narrative cover. If Robert had struggled with self-harm in the past, the story of him stabbing himself became fractionally more plausible. Not plausible enough to explain the knife in the block, not plausible enough to explain the blood pattern, not plausible enough to explain the yelling the neighbor heard. But plausible enough to muddy the water, and in the absence of a confession, muddy water was what Heather needed. Step back and look at what these interviews produced. Not one of them individually was enough to make a case, but together they built something. They built a portrait of a relationship that was loving on the surface and complicated underneath. A woman who needed control and a man who sometimes pushed back against it. A household full of alcohol every single night by the man's own deeply ingrained habit. A woman who could become physically aggressive with the people she loved most. A dynamic that someone who knew the couple, who had watched them together for months, described quietly, carefully as BDSM, as restraint, as something the man was not always entirely comfortable with. And they built a timeline that had a hole in it. A 2-hour hole roughly between 3:00 and 5:00 in the morning, during which a neighbor heard voices raised and nobody inside the house admitted to anything. Something happened in that window. Something that resulted in 3 stab wounds to a man's chest. Something that someone then spent time managing, cleaning, repositioning, replacing, removing evidence of before picking up the phone and calling for help at 5:40 in the morning. The witnesses could not tell investigators exactly what, but they had narrowed it down to a single room, a single window of time, and a single person who was awake and in that house when it happened. If you're the kind of person who obsesses over true crime cases, who lies awake thinking about the timeline, who notices the detail everyone else glosses over, then this channel is built for you. Subscribe, share, and tell me in the comments, do you think Heather acted alone? Because the next section, the formal detective interview, is where we find out what she does under pressure, and it is something else. There is an art to a detective interview, and it is not what television shows you. It is not aggressive, it is not accusatory, it does not involve slamming fists on tables or raising voices. The best investigators, the ones who actually get results, operate on a different principle entirely. They listen more than they speak. They agree before they disagree. They build a bridge between themselves and the subject, brick by careful brick, and then they wait to see what the subject does with that bridge. Detective Stanton was good at his job. And Heather Holbrook, sitting across from him in that room on the morning of November 29, 2020, was about to demonstrate, without ever fully realizing it, exactly how guilty she was. Stanton opened the interview gently. Background questions. How long had they been together? How had they met? What were Robert's health conditions? Easy things. Things designed to establish rapport and baseline behavior. What Heather looked like when she was telling the truth so that the deviations would be visible later. She answered fluently. The library, less than a year together, blood clots, ulcerative colitis, the lungs, he gets pain, he always complains about pain, his feet, his elbows, his head, everything was always hurting. Note that, file that away, because it will become one of her primary explanations for why she did not call for help when she should have. He always complained, she was used to it, she did not think this was different. It is a compelling story. It is exactly the kind of thing that could, in the right circumstances, be believed, and Heather had been building it all morning. Stanton moved to the timeline, walked her through it carefully, one beat at a time. She told him the story of the pie Robert wanted late at night, her getting up to warm it, him eating it in his office, then moving to the bedroom around 11:00 or midnight. Then it hurts. She said she did not ask what hurt because Robert always complained about pain. She said she went to bed, or rather to the couch. She said she checked on him sometime around midnight to 2:00 and saw blood. She said she cleaned him up. She said she went back to sleep. Stanton asked her about the steak knife. She said Robert had gestured when she asked what happened. She said he had told her steak knife. She said she had not seen any steak knife missing from the block, but that obviously he had cut himself with something. Stanton asked why she had not called an ambulance. Heather said the wounds did not look that bad. They looked like scratches, she said, like when you cut yourself washing dishes. Stanton asked her, even if they were superficial, wasn't the act itself a cause for concern? Even if it was just a scratch, the act of self-harm, the statement that he had done this to himself, wasn't that a warning sign? Heather said yes. She said she knew. She said she was a teacher. She said she was trained to recognize warning signs. She knew. And then she said it again. I failed, I'm sorry, I didn't. Stanton let it sit there. He did not push, he did not reassure her, he let those words exist in the room. I failed does not mean I didn't do it. I failed means I was there, I was present, I had the opportunity to act, and I didn't. Stanton moved carefully toward the central contradictions. He was not accusatory, he framed everything as concern, as trying to understand. He told her that in his experience, when someone says they did not do anything wrong, the autopsy results tend to confirm that. He told her the medical examiner would be able to determine the trajectory of the wounds, whether they were self-inflicted or not. He told her that toxicology would confirm the drinking. He was giving her information that a guilty person would need to calculate their exposure. And then he told her what was not adding up. The weapon. If Robert had stabbed himself, why was the knife back in the block? Why would someone who was dying make that journey, clean the blade, replace it precisely, and leave no trace of blood between the bedroom and the kitchen? Heather said she did not know. She said she had not seen any knife missing. She said she did not know why he would put it back. She said she knew she did not do this. Stanton told her that if Robert had not done this to himself, somebody else had, and there were not many people in that house. Heather said it was not possible. She said she loved him. She said they had found each other. She said they had finally found home. Stanton introduced the neighbor's testimony carefully. He told Heather that someone outside the house had heard yelling, male and female, between 3:00 and 4:00 in the morning from the direction of her home. Heather's response was immediate and smooth. She did not remember yelling. They did not argue. She did not know who would have been yelling. Stanton pressed gently. If Tyler and Elizabeth were asleep and the only people awake in the house were Heather and Robert, who was yelling? Heather said she did not know. She said she did not remember any yelling. She said she did not remember any fight. Not we did not fight. I do not remember any fight. The distinction is important. Not remembering is different from it not happening, and Stanton heard that distinction even if he did not name it in the room. Stanton asked about the intimate details of the relationship. He had been briefed on what Tyler had said. He needed to hear Heather's version. Heather told him about walking in on Robert watching pornography in June. She told him she had been angry. She told him they had agreed to watch things together occasionally after that. She framed it as a minor, resolved conflict. She did not mention BDSM. She did not mention restraint. She did not mention anything that Tyler had described as a consistent dynamic in the relationship. Stanton did not push this line directly. He noted it. But the contradiction between Tyler's account and Heather's account on this specific detail had now been created in the official record. Two witnesses, two completely different pictures of the same relationship. One of them was not telling the truth. Near the end of the interview, Stanton made his most direct statement. He told Heather that he did not think she was a bad person. He said he could see in her eyes that she was a good person, but things were not adding up, and he thought she had more to tell him. Heather's response was the most revealing thing she said in the entire interview. She did not say, "I have told you everything." She did not say, "I have nothing left to hide." She said, "I have nothing left. I've told you all I have nothing left, nothing. Nothing left, not nothing to tell, nothing left." That is the language of someone who has given out everything they decided to give, who has calculated what can be released and what must be held, who is not at the end of their knowledge but at the end of their willingness. Stanton let her go. He did not have enough yet. The arrest would come later, much later. But in that room on that morning, he had heard exactly what he needed to hear. He had heard the shape of what she was not saying. The interview ended, Heather was escorted out, and Detective Stanton sat with his notes and with a list of questions that the evidence had already answered, even if the law had not caught up to those answers yet. What had happened in that house was becoming clearer. What remained was the work of proving it, and that work was going to take 5 years. This is the moment in every case where I need you to do something for me. If you are watching this and you have made it this far, share this video. Send it to one person who loves true crime. Because the next section, the evidence reveal, is where 5 years of investigation come together in one arrest. And the phone evidence they found changes everything. Cases like this one do not always get resolved. That is a truth that anyone who covers true crime long enough has to sit with. Sometimes the evidence is there, but it is not enough. Sometimes the witnesses change their accounts. Sometimes time passes and memory degrades and the small details that would have made the difference disappear. Sometimes the guilty party walks. But sometimes, not always, not even often enough, the work holds. The evidence holds. And 5 years later, on April 1, 2025, officers arrived at a school in Farmington, New Mexico, waited for the final bell of the day, and arrested Heather Holbrook on a charge of homicide. This is what made that arrest possible. The autopsy was performed in Albuquerque, and its findings were definitive in a way that Heather's explanations could not survive. Robert Holbrook had sustained 3 deep stab wounds to the upper chest. Not 1, 3. The wounds were deep enough to collapse both lungs, not partially, not marginally, but completely. Blood had collected in his chest cavity and around his heart, a condition known as hemothorax and hemopericardium respectively. He had also sustained an abrasion to his forehead with underlying hemorrhage, consistent with his head striking a hard surface. The medical examiner concluded that the injuries were not consistent with a single accidental cut. They required significant directed force. And the pattern of the wounds, their depth, their location, their angle, it was not consistent with self-infliction. You cannot easily stab yourself 3 times in the upper chest. The reflex action of the body, the pain response, the physical awkwardness of the angle, these create a natural barrier to that kind of self-harm. Not an impossible barrier, but a significant one. And when that barrier is considered alongside the knife in the block and the absence of a blood trail, the self-harm theory does not merely weaken, it collapses entirely. The autopsy also confirmed that Robert had a significant amount of alcohol in his system. He was intoxicated at the time of death, heavily intoxicated, which raises another question that investigators had been sitting with. Was Robert in a state that night where he could have adequately defended himself against someone he loved, someone he trusted, someone he would not have expected to harm him? The answer, given his blood alcohol level and his physical condition, was almost certainly no. This is where the case broke open. Heather's phone, seized under the search warrant in the days following the incident, was subjected to a full forensic examination. And what investigators found on that phone contradicted virtually every element of the picture Heather had painted of her marriage. First, the text messages. Heather had told investigators there were no fights, no arguments, no tension. The relationship was a honeymoon, happy and uncomplicated. The text messages told a different story. There were discussions about drinking, Robert's drinking specifically, and the tension it created. There were messages about money, about financial pressure, about the stress of Heather being the sole income earner while Robert collected unemployment. There was conflict, there was friction. There was evidence that the surface of this relationship was not the whole of it. But the text messages, significant as they were not the most important thing on the phone. The most important thing was 6 video clips, recorded on October 23, 2020, 5 weeks before Robert's death. The clips were short, but they were devastating. They were recorded inside the home, and on them the couple could be heard arguing, not the minor domestic friction that Tyler had described, the Thanksgiving kitchen moment, the cider bottle disagreement. This was a real argument, escalating, loud, with insults. Robert's voice, audible on the recordings, was repeatedly demanding his belongings back. He wanted his things. He was trying to leave or threatening to leave or insisting on reclaiming something that Heather had control of. And Heather's voice was there too, reactive, escalating alongside his. These were the voices the neighbor had heard. Not on November 29th, she had heard them on that night too, but this recording proved the pattern. This was not a one-time eruption. This was a recurring dynamic. a relationship that had a private face that was entirely different from the public one. The videos also destroyed the narrative that there had been no argument on the night Robert died. If there had been arguments 6 weeks before severe enough to be recorded on a phone, and if the neighbor heard yelling between them in the early morning hours of November 29th, then the calm and loving household Heather had described was a fiction. And a fiction with Robert's blood on its hands. With the autopsy results, the phone evidence, the forensic blood analysis, and the witness testimony all compiled, investigators were finally able to construct a coherent theory of what had happened on that night. Robert and Heather had argued. The neighbor's account placed the yelling between 3:00 and 4:00 in the morning. The argument, consistent with the pattern documented in the October video clips, escalated. At some point in that bedroom or in a space adjacent to it, Heather had access to a steak knife from the kitchen block. Robert was heavily intoxicated, physically compromised, and likely unable to protect himself effectively. The wounds were inflicted, 3 of them, deep with force. Robert bled into the bed while Heather, perhaps in shock at what had happened, did what she told officers she had done. She cleaned him up. She tried to tend to him. But the wounds were not what she thought, or she chose not to call for help, and Robert died in that bed while she slept or pretended to sleep on the couch. Then she moved him, she cleaned the knife and replaced it in the block. She managed the scene as best she could. She got rid of the shirt. She rinsed out the washcloth. And at 5:40 in the morning, when she could not manage it any further, she called 911. And she started talking. Investigators presented their findings to the district attorney's office. The case was reviewed, the evidence was assessed, and the decision was made to move forward. On April 1, 2025, 4 years and 4 months after Robert Holbrook's body was found on the floor of that bedroom, officers arrived at the school where Heather was employed as a teacher. They had waited for the school day to end. They had waited for the children to leave. Heather came out and was approached by officers. "Can you put your hands behind your back, Heather? You have a warrant for homicide." Her first question was whether she could call her mom. Her second observation, and it landed with a particular kind of irony, was that she could not believe they had arrested her in front of the kids she worked with. She had spent 5 years teaching other people's children, standing in classrooms, building lesson plans, shaping young minds, while Robert Holbrook's family waited for justice that felt like it would never come. It came. Back at the station, Detective Stanton sat down with Heather one final time. He told her that the investigation was complete. He told her that the evidence they had processed did not match what she had told him in 2020. He told her that he knew what had happened to Robert, and he asked her for the last time to tell him why. Heather asked for an attorney, which of course was her right, and which of course was the end of that conversation. But the evidence did not need her to explain it anymore. The evidence was already speaking. Tell me in the comments, at what point did you know? Was it the knife in the block, the blood pattern, the "I failed"? Because I genuinely want to know where it clicked for you. That moment of realization is what this channel is built for. Heather Holbrook remains presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. I say that clearly and without hesitation because it is the truth and because responsible case analysis demands it. An arrest is not a conviction. A charge is not a verdict. The legal process exists for a reason, and whatever our instincts tell us as we review this evidence, the final determination of guilt belongs to a jury. But let us talk about what the evidence shows, because the evidence is remarkable. Robert Holbrook was stabbed 3 times. The wounds were deep, required significant force, and were not consistent with self-infliction according to the medical examiner's findings. Both of his lungs collapsed. Blood collected around his heart. He died in that bed alone in a house where another adult was awake and present. The weapon used to inflict those wounds was cleaned and replaced in the kitchen knife block. There was no blood trail between the bedroom and the kitchen. The biological material on the knife tip was consistent with the wound evidence. Someone made the deliberate choice to return that knife to its place in the block. The woman who called 911 had cleaned the victim's wounds, removed his clothing, rinsed out a washcloth, and repositioned his body before making that call. She had given officers multiple shifting versions of the night's timeline. She had in the same conversation told officers that if they ever found her with stab wounds in her chest, she had not done it herself, and that whoever was trying to convince them of self-infliction was probably the suspect. 5 years of investigation. A forensic review of phone evidence including 6 video recordings of domestic arguments from 5 weeks prior, text messages documenting financial tension and conflict, and an autopsy confirming the nature of the wounds, all of it produced a single arrest. The evidence does not know how to lie, people lie. Evidence simply tells you what happened. I want to say something about Robert before we close, because we have spent this entire video talking about what was done to him, about the evidence, about the investigation, about the arrest. And that is necessary, that is the work of accountability. But Robert Holbrook was a person. He was autistic in a world that does not make room for autism. He struggled, he drank too much, he had a history of emotional pain that went back decades and that he had never fully resolved. He had sent a message to his first wife in 2019, "I did not cut deep enough," that nobody read in time to respond to. And then he found something that helped. He found a person who made him feel at home. He made plans. He held a newborn and pointed at a video game screen and talked about building a porch and said, "I have finally found my person." He was 49 years old. He deserved better. He deserved someone to call for help when he needed it. He deserved the police to arrive in time rather than hours after the fact. He deserved to grow old in the home he thought he had finally found. And he deserved for this not to be forgotten, for his case not to sit in a file for 5 years before the people who loved him got any answers at all. That is why this channel exists. I keep coming back to that line. I keep coming back to it because it is the thing that makes this case unlike almost anything I have covered. She said it while officers were processing the scene, while her husband's body was still in the bedroom, while evidence was still being photographed and collected and cataloged. She looked at the room full of recording devices and she said, "If you ever find me with multiple stab wounds in my chest, I didn't do it myself. Whoever is trying to sell you on that is probably the suspect." She was right. The person trying to sell them on the idea that those stab wounds were self-inflicted was the suspect. She was telling them exactly how to solve the case, with her own voice, in her own words, in the room where she was standing. That is not irony, that is not coincidence. That is a person who understood exactly what the story was going to need to look like and who was already in the first moments of the investigation trying to shape it. The shape gave her away. Everything in this presentation was sourced from case files and recordings obtained through Official Freedom of Information Act requests submitted directly to the Farmington Police Department. The recordings, statements, and evidence presented here include previously unreleased material reviewed by this channel for the purpose of responsible public documentation. This channel does not editorialize beyond the evidence. We do not speculate beyond what the record supports. We do not name individuals as guilty who have not been adjudicated as such. All persons involved remain presumed innocent until a court says otherwise. What we do is document. We take what is public record and we make sure it is seen, because accountability requires visibility, and visibility requires someone to do the work. 1. Subscribe to Time with X if you have made it to the end of this video. You are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Someone who wants to understand. Someone who pays attention to the details. Someone who believes that the truth matters and that the people who did not get justice deserve to have their stories told. 2. Share this video. 1 share puts this case in front of someone who has never heard Robert Holbrook's name. 1 share means one more person who knows what happened in that house. 1 share is a small act of accountability. 3. Leave your comment below. Tell me where this case clicked for you. Tell me what detail you cannot stop thinking about. Tell me what you think should happen next. I read every comment, every single one. This community is what makes this work possible. Robert Holbrook was 49 years old. He had finally found home. He deserved more time there. This was Time with X. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.